Welcome, Fiona. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you, Jill, for having me. I really appreciate it.
You're so welcome. So we'll start off by just a couple of background questions. If you don't mind sharing with us how old you are, where you grew up originally, where you live now, because I do find that our background really shapes our beliefs about death and dying. So any information you're willing to share with us.
I grew up in the UK. I'm British. My heritage is partly Spanish, partly French, and partly Scottish and English. And I think that does make a difference as well. I'm 55. Okay, so as a child, nobody I knew died. I mean, both of my grandfathers had died before I was born. My grandmothers lived into their mid-80s. So it was not until I was in my 20s that they died. So during my actual childhood, literally nobody I knew died. And when it came to my grandmothers dying, obviously because they were in their mid-80s, it just felt normal. It was expected. And, I obviously missed them and everything like that. But it didn't come as a terrible shock or anything. And even one of my grandmothers, the one that was half French and half Spanish, she used to say to us almost, I think, every time we saw her, oh, this might be the last time you see me. So she prepared us for years and years for the fact that she wasn't going to be there at some point. And I think that might be a sort of South European thing, to be a little bit more kind of talking about death than British people. So that was my experience with death, or rather without death, as a child.
When your grandmother would say that to you, how did that make you feel? And what was your usual response to somebody saying, oh, this might be the last time you'll see me?
I think it was usually when we were kind of driving away, with the windows open, and she'd say that as we were waving goodbye to her. So I think I just kind of take a really good look at her and make sure I was being friendly and saying goodbye to her.
That's beautiful. Every time we say goodbye to somebody, it may be the last time. Mm. And oftentimes with today's busy society, we're rushing just from one thing to the next thing. And especially if you're packing up children or you're trying to get somewhere and you're just frazzled and you're throwing stuff around, and we're not taking that time to be very present with somebody as we're saying goodbye to them. And I love that your grandmother reminded you of that, because she was right. One day it was going to be the last time that you saw her.
Yeah, that's true.
When you were an adult, what was the first experience that you had with somebody either that was close to you or maybe not as close to you that had died?
I think it's in my teens. My French teacher died. So it was somebody who I saw quite regularly, but I wouldn't say that we were close. And she did seem very ancient. So again, it didn't really seem such a terrible shock. It affected me in the sense that I couldn't take my exam when my class couldn't take our exam when we were planning to take it. But other than that, it didn't really affect me, I'm afraid to say.
No, there's nothing wrong with that. Did the school do anything to kind of break the news to the students?
She was actually a retired teacher. I was in a special French class. There were only about 5 of us in the class, because it was all people who spoke French, because my grandmother was half French. She spoke to us in French. So it's people who lived in France or had a parent who was French, that type of thing. So there was only about 5 people in the whole school who knew her. So no, they didn't. I don't think so. They just told us. I don't think there was anything special that they.
When you were younger, did you have any beliefs about what would happen after we died?
I was brought up Catholic, very religious family, really. And I was taught that, you either go to heaven or hell. And so I guess that was a motivation to try and be good. And then there's this other concept of purgatory, which the Catholic Church has also talked about, where people who are not quite ready to get into heaven kind of go through a purification process after their physical death.
I was raised Catholic as well. My grandmother was very religious. She was very involved in her church, really involved in her faith. But my mother and I were not as religious. But what I did get from the Catholic religion was some of the fear and the guilt that kind of went with it. And so I felt growing up, I was not going to go to heaven, because there was really nothing I was ever going to be able to do that was going to make me good enough to be able to go to heaven. So I think I always assumed I was going to end up in purgatory and kind of have to work my way out of it. I don't believe that now. That's not my spiritual beliefs anymore. But I do remember growing up not being afraid of death, but being very aware of the fact that when I died, I was probably not going to make it to heaven. And I don't even know why. I think I just felt whenever I would go to church and I would listen to the priest speaking, or when I would go to confession, I would feel just really like I'm just not a good enough person. I'm never going to make it to heaven. And it bothered me a little bit, I think.
Really horrible.
Yeah, right. I feel like children should have to feel when they're growing up, but it was just a side byproduct, I guess, of the Catholic religion for me. I know it's not that way for everybody, but I really did grow up thinking that there was just no way I'd ever get into heaven.
Wow.
I knew my grandma was going to get there though, because she was amazing, but I certainly was not getting there.
I think for me, it was the opposite. It was like, well, I'm definitely going to go. Let's see about everyone else, but I'm definitely going to go. As I got older, I began to be quite worried about the fact that nobody had died in my family, apart from these two grandmothers, because other people had always lost an aunt or an uncle or something like that. And I thought, oh my goodness, when people die in my family, they're all going to die at the same time. It's all going to be like in quick succession. And in fact, that is what happened. So in 2017, my father died. He was in his mid-80s. So again, there was that feeling of, well, that's normal. It's not so unusual to die in your mid-80s. And I feel incredibly sorry for people whose spouses or children or parents die very young, very suddenly. My father had what they call vascular dementia. So he just slipped away very slowly over a process of 2 years. There was no sort of moment when he was dying. He was kind of in a process of dying for 2 years. I didn't really grieve him that much until one day I was dancing and all of a sudden, all this grief came out. It was the movement that brought it out, which was strange for me. And also because I would never cry in front of people. I've got 4 children. There was always somebody around, and so I would cry when I was driving, which obviously isn't the safest thing to do, but that would be when I was alone and when I would process my emotions.
I was just going to ask more about the dancing and the grief. I do believe that our body will hold it all in if we don't allow it to come out. And I think movement is a great tool to help us work with our grief. I'm sure at the time you maybe didn't love it, but I love that you were able to move that grief out of your body.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't do it deliberately, but it took me by surprise, but I thought it was very interesting that happened.
Did grieving your father the way that you did allow you to view grief differently or view death differently? How did that affect you?
The fact that I was kind of aware, I was grateful that he had those 2 years that we were able to prepare. You hear about these people who die in their mid-30s, leaving toddlers and things like that. And I was just grateful that he'd lived as long as he had, because he was 87. When his father died, aged like about 40 or something like that. He was always amazed that he had lived as long as he had as well. Yeah. But then what happened was 2 years later, my sister died. And 5 weeks later, my mother died.
Oh, wow.
So that was, quite a lot. We were a family of 5. So I do have one sister left, but that was a lot, over 2 years just to lose 3 members of the family.
What did your sister die from?
She actually had breast cancer, and she also had diabetes, and she also had mental illness. And people with mental illness are not very good at looking after themselves. So I think she actually had a lump or a pain in her breast for quite a few years before she actually went to the doctor. And her cancer was under control, but unfortunately, she'd had some treatments on her foot. You know how diabetic people have, they get wounds in their feet, and then it gets, I think the word is debriding or something, where they scrape scrape off the flesh of the bottom of the foot. So she wasn't able to walk. She also lost her sight in one eye. I think it was her kidneys that eventually gave up. The coroner and somebody else were kind of arguing about what the cause of death was. It's kind of a bit vague, but I think it was eventually her kidneys that gave up.
Was your mother sick for a while, or was her death more sudden?
So she was 84 when my father had his stroke, and it was around about the same time as my sister got diagnosed. She was very stressed and she had to drive every day to the hospital to see my father. I think the stress brought on dementia. I may have been coincidental, but it seemed to me like it was right at that moment when they both got sick. That was the only sickness that she had, was dementia. She didn't have any sort of physical sickness. My sister had moved back in with my parents. And so she was very, very close to my sister. And it was definitely a question of my mother couldn't live without my sister couldn't live without my mother. We felt it was very well organized. It definitely felt like it had been organized sort of in a very full way, and everything that once my sister had died, then my mother was able to let go and die.
That must have been hard for you, though, to lose so many people so close together.
And I think at the time I was just so busy doing everything that it kind of didn't hit me at first. It was only after I'd done all the funerals and everything that it hit me. So we live in the Cayman Islands and in the Caribbean. And so we were over visiting. The night my sister went into hospital, they had a carer at that point looking after her and my mother. And the carer said, oh, she needs to go to hospital. And I said, could we just have dinner first? And I had this sense that it was going to be like the last supper kind of thing. And so we took her to hospital afterwards. And that was a Thursday. And I saw her, I think I went to visit her on the Saturday. And that was the last time I saw her, on the Saturday. And she died. She was meant to have an operation to cut off the bottom half of her leg from the knee down. And she was meant to have it on the Friday. At that time, my other sister and the carer had gone out of the room just at the moment that the doctors came in and said, we're going to take you for the operation. And she said, no, they don't want it. And then they came back in and they convinced her to have it. But by the time they got in touch with the doctors again, they said, oh, well, we moved on to the next patient. You've missed it. And so she was supposed to have it. The Monday was a bank holiday, public holiday. She couldn't have the operation on the Monday. So they put her down for the operation on the Tuesday. And she died very early in the morning on Tuesday before the operation. It felt like she was so terrified of having this operation, and she was spared having to have her leg cut off and having to learn how to walk with a prosthetic leg. And she didn't have to then die of a very painful death of cancer. So it felt like a blessing. And with my mother, I was only supposed to be over for, 10 days or something. But after my sister died, I stayed. And the airline let us change the flight, for free and everything. And so I stayed for an extra few weeks because we couldn't have the funeral because of the doctors arguing about the cause of death. And eventually I just said, look, we don't care what you put on the death certificate. You have to give us a death certificate because we need to arrange a funeral because I've got flights to arrange and everything like that. I was able to spend 4 weeks with my mother, where I saw her every day and take her for a walk in the garden and that kind of thing, have cups of tea with her and just talk, even though it's like the same conversation again and again kind of thing. But it was lovely to have that time because I hadn't been alone with her for years. I've lived abroad for 21 years. It was actually when I was on the plane that my other sister contacted me and said that she'd had a fall. My mother had had a fall. And I thought, okay, well, she's always having falls, no problem there. Then it came through, another message came through saying, well, she's still unconscious. Meanwhile, I was sitting on the plane, literally we were about to take off, but it was delayed by an hour. And these messages were coming through during that hour. And eventually she said it's a stroke. They didn't say that how long they expected her to live at that point, but they said it was a stroke. At that point, I got off the plane and the air stewardess said, it's good that you're getting off the plane now because like 2 seconds later, we would have shut the doors. We were literally about to shut the doors. So I got off and I sat by her bedside for a week. And they said, when we got to the hospital, they said she's got a week to live. So I sat by her bedside for a week and just kind of stroked her arms and put moisturizer on her skin. They teach you to put a drop of water on the person's tongue because they can't drink, but their tongue gets very, very dry. I just would say things like, I love you and stuff like that. She tried to speak and it just came out gobbledygook. She seemed to be responding to what we were saying. So at one point, my aunt and uncle came and visited. We were talking about the fact that my sister had died, and I saw a tear pour down my mother's face. It felt like a very blessed time, and everything just felt like it was organized exactly right. And we were due to go on vacation. We had booked a vacation on, I think, the 31st of July. And my birthday's on the 30th. And so we said to the church, we'd like a funeral. Because I'd stayed there for a whole month, the funeral for my mother wasn't going to be for a few weeks. My husband said, why don't you come back home and we'll all travel together for the funeral? So I came back for a few weeks and then went back again. From the day that I was going to arrive, the 28th, and then there was the 29th, 30th, my birthday, and the 31st, we were going on vacation. So I contacted the priest. I said, look, we'd really like a funeral. It's got to either be the 29th or the 30th. I didn't mention that my birthday was on the 30th. I was prepared to have it on my birthday. And they looked in their book and they said, the only day we can do is the 29th. I said, that's great. I really didn't want to change our vacation. My mother led a prayer group called Mary and Martha. And because it was a Catholic prayer group, most of the people had in their name Mary at some point. She was Rosemary, other people were Mary something, so there was always this connection with Mary, but there was never a connection with Martha. And they used to joke about it. I chose the gospel reading for the Mass, and it was the reading of St. Martin. And then that was fine. I told the priest and everything. And then I thought, I'll just Google what the actual gospel of the day is. It was the St. Martha's Saints Day. I had no idea. I'd actually chosen the gospel of the day. So again, it felt very much like it was meant to be. My mother was a marriage counselor. She died on my wedding anniversary, which again felt very special.
I love that story because you're right. It does seem like so many things lined up for you to be able to be there and have the closure that you would probably have needed if you weren't there while it was all happening, and to be able to have that time with your mother, even if she was a little bit confused and repeating the same conversations. I think for you, it must have been really nice to spend that time with her and to be able to be there during that experience. Do you think that she knew that her daughter had died?
She definitely knew. The same day that my sister died, I had to break it to her. She was just crying and everything, and she's saying it's so sad. And later in the afternoon, she went for a walk and fell over. So all the cars had stopped and people came up to the house and told us to come and get her. I don't know why she went for a walk by herself, but she was clearly quite upset. And the next morning, very, very early in the morning, she was standing by the front door. The carer had locked the door so she couldn't get out by herself. And she was just like howling. And he came down and he's, what are you doing? Why are you howling? She said, well, you would howl too if your daughter had died. She would have a rest after lunch. So twice a day she would cry. She would cry when she woke up in the morning and then cry after this rest. After lunch, she just kept crying. But then a weird shift happened. She said to me one day, Fiona, I just can't stand it any longer. I cannot take it any longer. The next day I came to see her and she said to me, do you know, the carer was called Tony. Tony's daughter has died. It's so sad. I feel so sorry for him. His daughter has died. And it wasn't true at all. She had just projected it onto him because she couldn't take the grief. All these flowers kept turning up, obviously, at the house, and letters and cards and things. And I would read her the letters, but I would edit as I was going along, and I wouldn't mention the fact that my sister had died. And she said, oh, this is lovely. These people are so kind, and how nice of them to send us all these flowers. Isn't it lovely? And then we thought, what are we going to do? How are we going to tell her that she's got to go to a funeral of her daughter? Because, for that point, for about 2 weeks, she forgot. So the carer said, let's just tell her we're having a garden party. But before the garden party, we're going to go to church. So that's what we told her. And then it sort of slowly dawned on her again that my sister had died. And at one point she said something about my father, and we said, no, he's died. And she said, what? Not again? Or something like that. And we were like, oh gosh. So it was very difficult to kind of to deal with that. But also, so she would kind of go into lucidity and come out again. One lady turned up who I don't think know my sister that well. She was a friend of my other sister. And she came to the house and she was being very kind of hysterical, crying and everything. And my mother said, "Oh gosh, it's bad enough having to deal with our own grief without having to deal with everyone else's grief."
She's not wrong, though.
It's like, this woman didn't even know my sister that well, you know?
It seems that oftentimes when somebody dies, it's not even necessarily the grief for that person. It's all the other grief that we've held inside for so long that is just bubbling up. And in that case, it could have really been one of those things as well, that there was just grief and fears that she had not dealt with. And it seemed to be that it was your sister's death that she was grieving, when really it was just a whole bunch of other stuff she had not processed yet, which is unfortunate. I think that's even more why we need to process our griefs as they're happening. Oftentimes we push them all down. We don't want to deal with them for whatever reason. Sometimes it's shame, because society will sometimes shame us for grieving things. It amazes me how many times I'll talk to somebody and their pet will die. And they'll say, "Well, I'm really embarrassed to talk about it at work, about how much I'm grieving," because people are just like, "It's just a dog." Like, anybody that's ever had a pet, though, will tell you it's not just a dog. It's part of your family, and we don't give enough space for people to grieve things properly. And so what do? We all shove it deep down so that we don't have to deal with it, and it will come out eventually.
That's interesting you should say that, because my mother had had 3 miscarriages when she was younger. And when I asked her about them, she wouldn't talk about it, because I suppose in those days you didn't talk about miscarriage.
It was normal enough that people didn't talk about the grief over it.
Mm.
And there is thankfully a little bit of a shift in that, but people still don't always take it seriously when you think about the death of a child versus a miscarriage, or even a stillborn baby versus a child. There's just this like assumption that you shouldn't really grieve that much, which to me, grief needs to be felt. It needs to be honored. And unfortunately, the judgment from the people around us really prevents us from fully feeling things, because we're afraid of what people are going to say. And I think this is actually a great opportunity too, to talk more about what you do as your career, because I want to hear more about that. And then I think we can really actually connect it with some of the death and dying stuff as well.
I help women who feel that they have a sense of purpose, whether it's voluntary work or a business that they want to do. They feel called to something. And I help them to grow their confidence and to get clarity around what they need to do, and just to be more courageous in stepping out and doing this thing that they're called to do.
How did you get into this type of work?
The fact that my mother was a marriage counselor meant that she had lots and lots of books about relationships and self-development and things like that. I had that from a very young age. I was able to read those, and I had issues myself with depression and things like that. So I was always very keen, especially after I had children and I wasn't working. I spent a lot of time reading self-development books. So I think that was the start of it. I definitely felt that I had a calling to help other people who'd been through similar things. And I thought I didn't want other people to suffer what I've suffered.
It's important for us to take our experiences and teach other people and help other people, because I think oftentimes we feel very alone in what we're going through in life. And it can be so helpful just to have somebody say that they went through something similar. And maybe not that you're even telling them what to do, but just saying, this is how I was able to work through this or process it. And that's really, I think, the connection that I thought of about death and dying to the work that you do, is that when I was becoming a death doula, first off, I was 40 years old when I decided to make a career change. And I was scared. Part of me, what am I doing? This is crazy. I started in food service. I'd been in food service for 20 something years at the time. And I just felt this calling to work with people around the end of life. And I'd felt the calling, I think, since I was a child. But because it seemed weird to people, it was scary to people, whatever else it was, I just kind of pushed it down and I pushed it away. It was still there, though. It wasn't going away. Eventually, I said, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to take the leap. I'm going to go through this training. And then as I started going through the training and I started learning more about death and dying and grief and learning how there's regrets that people have when they're at the end of life. And one of the biggest regrets is not living their own life because of fear of judgment, of what their family wanted for them, people essentially telling them that what they want is wrong and that it's not something that is going to make you money or whatever else. And so people have gone through their entire lives living essentially somebody else's life. And then when they're on their deathbed, that's one of their biggest regrets is that they don't have more time to live their own life. They spent their entire life living somebody else's. And the more that I started to really think about that and really believe it in my core, the more that now I'm doing things like starting this podcast, which is totally taking me out of my comfort zone and really making me face some of my fears and push up against some of my, what I didn't even realize I had, perfectionist tendencies. But I do because I delayed starting the podcast because I couldn't figure out how to do it perfectly. And eventually I thought, well, one day I am going to die. And do I want to look back and say, you didn't start that podcast because you were afraid it wasn't going to sound perfect? Or do I want to look back and be really happy that I did it and I was able to connect with a lot of people and have these conversations and know that these conversations helped somebody else that is going through something similar? I feel like your work is doing a lot of that same thing, which is just giving people permission to live their own life and not necessarily the life that was taught to us or given to us when we were younger.
Yeah, not having to live up to other people's expectations. Absolutely. And you are allowed to feel what you feel, just another thing that's quite important. I just thought about something that happened after my sister and mother died. My older sister and I were clearing out my parents' house, and she'd gone back to London to be with her husband, and I was alone at the house clearing stuff out. And I was taking stuff outside to burn because there was just so much stuff to get rid of. And, I was kind of crying as I went along. But something emerged which I have never heard of. I've never seen it on a film, or anything like that. Was this way of crying that kind of comes from deep down within, and it's like a groan. And I don't know whether this is something that everybody does when somebody dies, but it was a kind of a deep kind of moan right from the depths. And I think it was quite loud because all of a sudden my sister rang up, and I think she'd had a call from the neighbours. So wondering what was going on. And she said, "Are you all right?" But I just thought it was worth mentioning because I think this must be something that's probably normal, and maybe lots of people have it, but no one ever speaks about it.
I think it's a very primal type of reaction. It's our body's way, because if you think when you're moaning or yelling or crying, it actually will vibrate in your body. Your body will feel that vibration all throughout it. And that's a way that we are able to release some of the energy that is essentially just trapped inside, which that grief will just get trapped inside. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because you're right. People don't often talk about the very real primal animal type of ways that our body will naturally want to react. But how many people would feel that feeling coming up and then stop it because they're afraid the neighbors will hear, or what will somebody think if they hear it? And so they try to stop themselves from experiencing that release, essentially, that release of that energy. I'm glad you shared that with us. I think that's a good one for people to know, that it's normal and it's natural for your body to want to sleep a lot, to want to do things to allow itself to process the grief that we're feeling essentially all throughout our bodies. But we're often taught not to trust what our bodies feel.
Yeah.
We just have the thoughts in our mind of what we've been taught to believe, or worry about what other people will think. I was raised very Catholic, so when I would go to funerals, they tended to be very quiet, at least where I'm from, right? So I'm from New Jersey, so it's, Northeast United States, very almost like stoic. You don't really show too much emotion. If you're crying, you're just like blotting a little bit. It's not a lot of noise. It's not a lot of emotions, essentially. And then I went to a funeral for somebody whose family was from Puerto Rico. And I had never seen anything like this, where people were wailing and actually like almost like laying on his body, like climbing onto the casket and laying on him. And I was like, wow, what is happening? I wasn't looking at it in a judgmental way. I was just so confused because I'd never seen anything like that. I mean, his mother was wailing. There was other family. I mean, just there was so much noise and so much energy. And I really felt that in some ways, that's probably a healthier way to do it than the way that I was raised, which was hold it all inside and maybe show it when you're alone. I taught myself to hold everything in. And so I almost went through a period of a couple years, more than a couple years. I went through a period of at least 10 or maybe even 15 years where I didn't cry at all, ever, because I had so much shame around crying and showing emotions that I taught myself not to cry and show emotions. And then eventually, even if I was by myself, I couldn't cry because I would feel so much shame that I would just push everything back down. All came out eventually. And for me, it usually came out that I would get angry and aggressive with people, which it was still that release of the energy, but it really would have been much healthier if I would have just felt like I could cry and show that emotion, even if I was alone.
That reminds me of a time when a friend of mine rang up and said, somebody at your husband's workplace has died. Don't worry, it's not your husband. I don't know who it is, but someone has died in a car crash. And I was going around the supermarket, and in my head, I was thinking, oh, who is it that's died? And was it such and such a person? And then I'd start crying for that person. And then I thought, no, maybe it was this, because they told me where the location was. So I was trying to figure out who was connected to that location. And I went through several people and I grieved all of them. And because I didn't know which one to grieve. And I'm wandering around the supermarket in floods of tears. And I see another friend and she says, oh, you've got to go home. You can't cry in the supermarket. You've got to go home. And I was like, well, I need food. There's no food in the house. So I don't have time to go home, cry and come back. So it was just really interesting that she was like, she wouldn't kind of allow me to feel what I was feeling because it was in a public place. And what would people think,
That's their own discomfort. And that's a lot of why we don't grieve properly, because other people try to shut it down because it makes them uncomfortable. And we are so worried about other people's feelings and how it's affecting somebody else that then we just have taught ourselves. Because you'll hear it often that somebody that's grieving will be told, it's been a couple months. You're not over this yet. Or, again, maybe it's something that people don't put as much value on. Like, well, it was just a dog. Why are you upset? Well, it only happened 2 days ago. What do you mean, why am I upset? And it's really more about their discomfort, because it's really going to end up triggering their grief that they haven't processed. It's like this chain reaction. So they want to shut everybody down when they're grieving so that they don't have to deal with their own grief, when really we all just need to deal with our own grief. And I think we'd all be happier and healthier in the way that we interact with each other,
Absolutely.
especially when somebody dies, because we're all going to have to experience somebody dying. We're all going to have to experience the grief that comes with somebody dying. And if we could support each other through it rather than shaming and shutting it down, we've lost so much of that community, that sense of being held by the community. Now it's so lonely for a lot of people when they're experiencing caregiving a loved one or the grief of losing a loved one. It just can be very isolating and lonely. And that makes me really sad for people. I think we should try to change that, which is what I'm trying to do. Is there any other things that you want to leave the listeners with? Any other thoughts, even about your work or about death, dying, and grief?
I've just started a Facebook group. The name is Called to Courage. It's for women. And so anyone who's listening who might want to join it is very welcome to join. I've also written an ebook, very short ebook, which is about boosting your confidence. So if anyone wants a copy of that, they can let me know as well.
Perfect. And I'll put a link to your Facebook group in the bio. What would be the best way for people to reach you? Would it be through Facebook or a website?
Yes, through Facebook Messenger would be great. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I love my Facebook group. So I think you'll find you can build a really beautiful community in a Facebook group. I love connecting with people around a topic that we're not often comfortable talking about. And so I hope you can find your own community as well in your Facebook group.
Yes, thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for coming on today. I appreciate it. I appreciate you sharing so much of your story. If anybody needs to reach you, I am going to put all of your links in the show notes so they can reach out to you sometime.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming on.